This whiskey might have a really complicated name, but it is very tasty. This week, let me tell you about the latest release from Dingle Irish Whiskey, Grianstad an Gheimhridh. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, I'm the whiskey nerd, and like I said, this week I'm looking at the latest release from Dingle Irish Whiskey, Grianstad an Gheimhridh. So let me get it into the glass and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Now first off, the name. Now Dingle themselves have said that they know this is a complicated name because it's after being named after a kind of a complicated name of an Irish festival, Grianstad an Gheimhridh. If you're not familiar with Dingle, they are an Irish distillery and they have this series going on right now, the Wheel of the Year, where they are releasing special bottlings for different kind of Celtic festivals that mark different parts of the year, and this one here is Grianstad an Gheimhridh. Irish, for those of you who don't know, is pretty simple enough language, but it has Grian meaning the word sun, Stad meaning the word stop, and Gheimhridh means kind of like winter. So if you think about it, it means the stopping of the sun in winter, or it's the winter solstice, the day when the sun is at its lowest point and when the day is the shortest. In Ireland, in winter, especially around the solstice, the days can be very short. You only get a couple of hours of sunlight. So ancient Celtic Irish people would have been looking at the sun and have been marking it and saying, okay, the sun has gone up, it's gone down, it's gone down, gone down. It's now at its lowest point, so we are in the heart of winter. But if the sun's at its lowest point, the only way it can go is back up. So there's a little bit of a kind of a twofold to this kind of festival. One, it's the depth of winter. It's the heart of winter. It is cold, it is damp, it is dreary, and you know you've still got a bit of time left before you're back into those kind of spring festivals. But at the same time, you know that you're on your way back out towards the spring, towards the warmer weather, towards the brighter days. So there's a little bit of that kind of like, it's now the heart of winter, time to settle in, gather around, get your family together and just kind of, you know, celebrate that you've made it through the hardest part of winter, but there's still a bit more to go. And that's why they decided to release this whiskey here, Grianstad an Gheimhridh, because it's a very sweet, full-flavoured, full-bodied whiskey. It was an Irish whiskey, of course, coming from the Dingle distillery down in the Dingle Peninsula in Ireland. It was matured primarily in bourbon casks before being transferred over to tawny port casks. Now it spent about 4.5 years in those bourbon barrels before being transferred to the tawny port casks for about 2.5 years. So this whiskey is all told about 7 years old. Now bourbon barrels, Dingle sourced their barrels from Heaven Hill, Maker's Mark and other kind of bourbon producers in America, but for the tawny port casks they sourced them from Graham's, which is one of like the biggest, most well-established port producers in the world, as well as the Cavs Santa Marta, which is more of a smaller kind of niche producer. If you're not familiar with port, I'm not going to get into the details of it, but ruby port is kind of like what we would call the younger ports, maybe only been aged for a little bit, but tawny port is the port that's been in casks for a number of years. The casks that this went into held port for over 20 years, so it's quite old, and that aging gives the port less of like that bright fruity flavors. It's still full of fruit, it's still like a fortified wine, but has less of those kind of bright flavors and more of those deeper, darker, rich fruit flavors, as well as some caramel notes and a little bit of nuttiness, and that really does translate through really well into whiskey because it does kind of complement to the natural caramel kind of flavors you get in whiskey. As for the whiskey, like I said, it is an Irish single malt whiskey. It's a triple distilled single malt whiskey, and it comes in at 50.5% alcohol by volume, which is about 101 proof. All the kind of releases in the Wheel of the Year series are at that kind of higher proof than you would normally see from an Irish whiskey, just to give more of the flavour and just give more of that kind of character from each of these kind of unique releases into the bottle. This is a limited release. I think there's only 7,800 bottles for the whole world, so it's not the biggest release in terms of Irish whiskey, but it's still not going to be really hard to find. Like, they're spreading out the bottles pretty far and wide, so you should be able to find it, maybe not immediately right now because it's just been released, but they will kind of travel around and you will see them in your markets eventually. And that's enough talking about the whiskey. It's time we go in for the nose on the Dingle Grianstad an Gheimhridh. Okay, immediately I'd say that the Dingle kind of note shines through. If you're familiar with Dingle's malt whiskey, it has this kind of like a earthy, herbal kind of character to it. Not quite mint, not quite like cardamom seeds, but that kind of like earthy flavor. It's not like those spices, more like those kind of earthy flavors coming through, and that is absolutely apparent here. The port, definitely huge influence of the port, but that hasn't overpowered that kind of core Dingle DNA in here, and I quite like that core flavor of the Dingle, so I'm glad to see it hasn't been lost. But that port, it is rich, it's thick, it's jammy. Like I said, that tawny port is aged for a bit longer, so it has that kind of deeper, more robust flavors, but still very fruity, and that has definitely come through here. There's like this kind of blackberries, jammy, rich, syrupy fruits, and maybe it's just because like Thanksgiving was a few days ago, and in this household we celebrate Thanksgiving because my wife Rose is American, so we have a Thanksgiving meal. But I'm almost reminded of that, you know, the cranberry sauce, like that kind of sweet, jellied, thick cranberry sauce, and that kind of note is coming through here, where it's that fruity berries, absolutely, but extra sugar, extra sweet, extra rich. There's also like a little bit of cinnamon note coming through as well, like a bit of ginger spice, bit of cinnamon, like those, if you think of like those kind of Christmassy sugar cookies you get that have winter spices, that have a bit of gingerbread, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, all those kind of baking spices, that kind of flavor, but in that kind of a biscuity, kind of roasted, toasted grain note as well. Yeah, and then there's just still all that rich, dark, jammy fruits like blackberries. I wouldn't say like blueberries or raspberries, it's more of those darker, deeper fruits, that kind of rich, sweet, kind of jam note coming through. So I think that's probably enough talking about the nose on the Dingle Grianstad and Gheimhridh. Let's go in for the palate. Cheers. It is spicy, it is sweet, it is rich, spicy, real cinnamon on one hand, mixed with like that dark fruit jam on the other side. Also a little bit of like dark chocolate note coming through, not like a really rich high cocoa, not like an 85% cocoa dark chocolate coming through, but something more like a 60%, where it's still quite sweet, still quite like milky and creamy, but definitely on the darker side of chocolate coming through. Like, it's reminding me a little bit of, there's these sweets you can get, they're kind of like fruit jellies that have been covered in a dark chocolate. I'll see if I'll put a picture of it up there because I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's that kind of note. It's like those dark blackberry fruit jellies covered with a little bit of dark chocolate and loads of spice, loads of that cinnamon, a little bit of ginger coming through as I was kind of holding it there, but massive upfront, huge hit of cinnamon. So I'm gonna go in for a second sip, see what else I can find. Cheers. The second sip around, I would point out, I can kind of feel the ABV on this one, 50.5%. It's not the highest, not the hottest in the world, and I can feel, it's not like it's not sharp, but it is a little bit tingly. I can feel the warmth spreading out. You can definitely know this is like that higher proof alcohol in here. But in terms of the flavors I was getting, definitely getting still those kind of gingery notes, that cinnamon notes coming through. The malty, biscuity note I was kind of getting on the nose, that's quite subdued here. I mean, I'm still getting that malty funk, that classic kind of Dingle malty flavor, but it's less biscuity and more like the kind of the grains, more like that actual malted barley note coming through on this. The baking spices though, they're still there. It's just less of that biscuity note. It's still got cloves, star anise, those kind of like rich, dried baking spices definitely coming through, as well as, like I was saying, that kind of creamy dark chocolate, the fruit berries, and all those kind of spices coming through. Very nice on the nose, quite sweet. Kind of the mouthfeel, I'd say, is like medium dense. It's not like oily, it's not sticking to my tongue, but at the same time, like, it's still lasting. I mean, I'm not going to talk about the finish just yet, but it is definitely lasting. It is definitely hanging around that bit more than like a lighter whiskey would. But now I think it's time I go in with another sip and time to focus on the finish. Cheers. Okay, like I said, up front, big bang in that spice. You get that port as well coming right in behind it. You get that spice, you get that fruitiness, as you take a breath, as it starts to fade off, that spice, it mellows relatively quickly. It doesn't just fall off a cliff, but it does mellow. Whereas that fruity note, the dark chocolate, that kind of lingers on. Like the port influence, like I said, huge port influence in here. A very kind of like that sticky kind of port. Like I said, not oily, not rich, but just that kind of hanging around kind of feeling you get from some of those kind of fruit jellies where you get that little bit of like kind of stickiness there. Yeah, I'd say it's relatively long. Like I said, the ABV probably definitely helps here with that finish. Does let it linger on a bit longer, give you that bit more of a kind of a full flavored note into the finish. I wouldn't say anything new shows up in the finish. It's not like some whiskies where they do get a bit of a left turn in the finish and you get something new. It's just everything kind of mellowing out and chilling out into the finish. Before I give my final thoughts on the Dingle Grianstad and Ghira, if you're new here, scroll down, hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button. I put out whiskey reviews like this every Wednesday, and I put out cocktail recipes featuring whiskey every Friday. So if you want to see more like that, make sure you scroll down, hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button, and while you're there, leave me a comment and say if you've tried any of the Dingle whiskies, what did you think of them? If you've tried any of their special edition releases from the Wheel of the Year, let me know what your favorite one is. And if you just want to see other kind of content, let me know what whiskies you think I should review in future. But for now, as for this whiskey, I like it. I do quite like, I mean, look, if you've been watching any of the videos on the channel, you know I really like a port finished whiskey. I really like having that kind of dark berries, you know, dark chocolate, that kind of note. I think it adds a lot to a whiskey, so not going to be surprising. I like this whiskey. I would actually prefer this to the recently released the Redbreast Tawny Port cask, where they released a whiskey also finished in Tawny Port. I think that whiskey was a bit lacking. It went into bourbon barrels, then sherry, and then into port. And I think that sherry in the middle really took away from the port that they were trying to deliver on the finish. This here though really leans into the port. If you're looking for port influence in a whiskey, this one here I would say is much better than that Redbreast Tawny Port cask, and it's cheaper and it's easier to find, I'd say, than that special edition Redbreast. So if you're looking for an Irish whiskey with a Tawny Port cask, this fantastic example of that, especially with just being from Dingle. Dingle are making some great whiskies. Now, where would I rank this in that Wheel of the Year series? Well, my favorite currently right now is the Lunasa release, the one they released here for summer for the Celtic Festival of Lunasa, the Harvest Festival. And in kind of preparing for the review, I tried them both against each other. I tried which one I think I liked the best, and for me, for my money, very close, but I think the Lunasa pipped it just by a little bit. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Dingle Grianstad and Ghira has a lot going on. It probably has more going on than the Dingle Lunasa release, but this is just a really well made, really nice Irish whiskey. I mean, I know it was aged in bourbon casks and then finished in a fresh bourbon cask, so it's just kind of doubling down on those notes you get from bourbon, but I thought it came through really well and it was really tasty. Now, if I review these on different days, maybe I would have preferred the Grianstad and Ghira to the Lunasa, but it's just a hair between it. I think the Lunasa is still my favorite from the series so far, but with this being a very close second. So I think that's all there is to say about this whiskey. Like I said, I put out cocktail recipes every Friday, and I will have a cocktail recipe featuring this whiskey this Friday, so if you want to see that, make sure you check back, and I'll see you then. Sláinte.